I had lived in that neighborhood long enough to believe I understood the rules of the game, the unspoken balance between minding your own business and keeping things neat enough to satisfy the homeowner association. And for years my yard had never drawn so much as a sideways glance, let alone a warning, because every morning under the bright daylight I stepped outside in the same routine, boots on, checkered flannel catching the sun, coffee in hand. Taking in the sight of the yard that I'd shaped slowly and deliberately, not flashy, not chaotic, just solid, functional, and anchored by a feature that had been there since before I ever signed the deed. A feature that gave the property weight and character instead of looking like every other copy-paste lawn on the block. The neighborhood itself was quiet, the kind of place where lawns were trimmed on schedule and conversations stayed polite, and the HOA liked to present itself as a guardian of order rather than an authority, which is why what happened next felt so jarring, because it came without warning, without discussion, and without reason. That morning, as the sun climbed high and the street settled into its usual calm, I noticed something different the moment I stepped outside. Bright markers planted in the grass where there had been nothing the day before, 3 of them placed deliberately around my yard feature like boundary posts, each one holding a laminated notice stamped with the Homeowner Association's insignia. And before I even read the words, I felt the shift in my gut. Because nobody marks another man's property like that unless they think they already own it. I walked closer, pulled one of the notices free, and read language so bold and absolute it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a claim stating that my yard was under review, that the feature was deemed non-compliant under updated standards, and that the Homeowner Association reserved the right to take corrective action, including assumption of control. And that was when the anger started to simmer, not hot, not explosive, but steady, because I knew exactly what I was looking at. A power move disguised as procedure. I hadn't even finished reading when I heard heavy footsteps approaching fast, the unmistakable sound of someone who didn't intend to ask permission. And when the HOA president came into view, clipboard tucked under his arm, voice already raised before he reached me, it confirmed everything because he didn't greet me, didn't explain, didn't ask questions. He declared loudly and publicly that the association had taken control of my yard feature and that compliance was mandatory. I asked him what rule I had violated calmly, because that's how you expose nonsense, and instead of answering, he told me the rules had been revised, that the board had acted in the best interest of the community, and that my cooperation was expected, which was the first sign this wasn't about any actual violation, because no legitimate rule appears overnight without notice and lands squarely on one homeowner's lawn by coincidence. Neighbors started drifting closer, drawn by the volume and the spectacle, and the HOA president leaned into it, raising his voice, pointing at the feature like it was a threat, insisting it didn't meet the new standards, standards he couldn't define beyond vague language about appearance and control. And when I pointed out that the feature had been present during inspections, approved implicitly by years of silence, he dismissed that as irrelevant. Claiming the association had the right to reinterpret compliance at any time, a statement so arrogant it made several neighbors exchange looks. That was the moment it became clear this wasn't a misunderstanding or a clerical error, it was a test of whether I would fold like others had, whether I would argue emotionally, panic over fines, or accept authority that didn't exist simply because it was delivered loudly enough. He announced that notices would remain posted, that further evaluation would continue, and that refusal to comply could result in penalties, liens, or further action. And he said it all with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged successfully. I told him plainly that he did not have the authority to take control of my yard, that my property rights didn't disappear because someone revised a guideline, and his response was to smile and say the Homeowner Association had broader authority than most homeowners realized. A sentence that stuck with me because it revealed the entire mindset behind what was happening. The sun beat down, everything in clear daylight, no shadows to hide behind, and yet he spoke as if the rules operated in some private space where homeowners weren't allowed to look too closely. And as he walked away, leaving the notices staked in my grass like flags of occupation, I realized this wasn't just about my yard anymore. It was about how far the association believed its power extended, and how often that belief went unchallenged. I stood there for a long moment after he left, neighbors murmuring, the notices fluttering in the light breeze, and instead of ripping them all out in anger, I took photos, close-ups of the language, the dates, the claims. Because experience had taught me something important, that the louder someone is about their authority, the more likely it is that authority doesn't actually exist. As the morning stretched on and the situation settled into an uneasy quiet, I went back inside not to cool off, but to prepare, because if the Homeowner Association thought it could take control of my yard with a clipboard and revised wording, then it was time to remind them of something far older and far stronger than their bylaws, something they hadn't considered at all: state statutes that didn't care about neighborhood politics, didn't change overnight, and didn't bend just because someone wanted control. And as I began pulling documents, records, and legal references together under the same bright daylight where this all started, one thing became clear: the association had made a serious mistake. And the moment they decided to push beyond their limits, they stopped dealing with a homeowner and started dealing with the law itself. The escalation began the moment the Homeowner Association realized I wasn't backing down, because authority that isn't questioned grows louder when it senses resistance. And by the next morning, under the same unforgiving daylight, the situation had shifted from planted notices to coordinated pressure, with additional paperwork taped to my door, warning letters dropped into my mailbox, and volunteers appearing in pairs to photograph my yard from angles that had never mattered before. All of it done with exaggerated seriousness meant to intimidate rather than inform. When the HOA president returned, his tone had changed from declarative to punitive, announcing that my refusal to cooperate had been documented as noncompliance, that fines were now under consideration, and that continued resistance would force the association to intervene directly, a phrase he repeated often without ever explaining what it actually meant, because vagueness was his favorite weapon. I asked again, publicly and clearly, for the exact bylaw authorizing the association to take control of a private yard, and instead of answering, he accused me of being combative, claimed I was disrupting community harmony, and warned that my attitude would be taken into account during enforcement proceedings, which drew visible discomfort from the volunteers standing behind him, men who clearly hadn't signed up to be part of a power play. Neighbors gathered again, some openly skeptical, others quietly worried, because everyone understood that if the HOA could invent authority over my yard today, there was nothing stopping it from doing the same to theirs tomorrow, and that awareness shifted the atmosphere from curiosity to tension. The president leaned into the moment, raising his voice, pointing at my yard feature as if it were a threat to public safety, insisting it violated updated aesthetic standards, and when pressed to define those standards, he defaulted to broad language about uniformity, control, and consistency, words that sounded official but meant nothing when applied to actual property law. He announced that a contractor had been contacted, that removal options were being explored, and that if I didn't voluntarily relinquish control, the association would proceed without my consent. And that statement marked a turning point, because it was no longer implied overreach, it was explicit. I told him clearly that any attempt to enter my property or remove anything would be considered trespassing, and his response was to laugh and say the HOA had the right to act in the community's best interest, a statement that drew audible reactions from neighbors who had never heard it framed so boldly before. As the day wore on, the pressure intensified, emails arriving from the HOA office warning of escalating penalties, phone calls reminding me of compliance deadlines that had never been formally issued, and a new set of notices appeared in the yard, worded more aggressively than the first, referencing enforcement authority that didn't exist, but was presented as if repetition alone could make it real. When I removed those notices, the president accused me of interfering with HOA operations, a claim so absurd it actually strengthened my resolve, because interference implies legitimacy, and nothing he had produced met that standard. The escalation reached another level when he attempted to call an impromptu compliance hearing, announcing it via email less than an hour before it was supposedly scheduled. No agenda, no quorum, no formal notice, just another performance designed to overwhelm rather than resolve. And when I declined to attend, stating that any legitimate communication should be handled properly, and in writing, he declared my absence an admission of guilt. A move that might have worked on someone unfamiliar with process, but only served to further expose how recklessly he was operating. Neighbors began documenting everything now, phones out, notes taken, conversations recorded, because the pattern was impossible to ignore. The HOA president wasn't enforcing rules. He was inventing them in real time, and each invention contradicted the last. When the contractor he claimed to have hired finally appeared, the situation nearly exploded, because the moment the man saw the feature, the notices, and the gathering of witnesses, he hesitated, asking basic questions about authorization and permits that the HOA president couldn't answer. And when I calmly informed the contractor that the feature was protected and that removal would violate state statutes, the man backed away, unwilling to proceed without clarity. Which sent the president into a visible rage, shouting that refusal was unacceptable, that the HOA's authority was being undermined, and that he would find someone else if necessary. That public failure shifted the dynamic completely, because nothing undermines a show of power faster than someone refusing to play along, and the neighbors saw it clearly, murmurs turning into open criticism, questions turning into challenges. And for the first time, the HOA president wasn't commanding the scene, he was reacting to it. He threatened higher fines, warned of liens, claimed legal action would follow, but each threat sounded emptier than the last, because none of them were accompanied by anything concrete, just louder delivery and more dramatic language. I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue point by point. I simply repeated the same message, that the HOA had no authority to take control of my yard, that any further attempts would be documented, and that the matter would be addressed through proper legal channels, and that calm refusal seemed to unnerve him more than anger ever could. As the sun dipped slightly and the crowd thinned, the yard looked unchanged. But the situation had escalated beyond any chance of quiet resolution. Because the HOA president had committed himself publicly to a course of action he couldn't legally support, and walking it back would mean admitting he was wrong, something his ego clearly couldn't tolerate. By the end of the day, I had a stack of emails, photographs, recorded statements, and contradictory notices that painted a clear picture of harassment and overreach. And as I organized them under the same bright daylight that had exposed everything else, I understood that escalation wasn't just about pressure, it was about mistakes. And the harder the HOA pushed, the more evidence it created against itself. The association believed it was tightening control, but in reality it was building a record that would soon matter far more than any fine or threat. And as I prepared for the next step, one thing was certain: the conflict had moved past neighborhood politics and into territory the HOA was completely unprepared to navigate, because the next escalation wouldn't come from a clipboard or a raised voice, it would come from the law, and once that happened, there would be no undoing what had already been set in motion. The crisis hit its peak on the third day, not because the Homeowner Association suddenly gained more power, but because it finally revealed how little restraint it actually had, and that realization came under full daylight when the HOA president arrived earlier than usual, already agitated, already convinced the situation needed to be forced to an end, because patience had never been his strength. He didn't come alone this time. He brought more volunteers, more paperwork, and an attitude that suggested decisions had already been made behind closed doors. And the first thing he announced, loudly enough for half the street to hear, was that the association was moving forward with direct control measures. A phrase so deliberately vague it was meant to scare rather than inform. He declared that fines were now active, not pending, not conditional, but active, retroactive to the moment I first removed an HOA notice from my yard. And when I asked for written confirmation approved by the board, he said verbal notification was sufficient under emergency authority, an emergency that he still couldn't define. Neighbors gathered quickly, some standing on sidewalks, others leaning against mailboxes, because by now everyone sensed that something was wrong, and when someone asked what the emergency was, the president snapped that disorder itself was the emergency, that allowing one homeowner to resist HOA control threatened the stability of the entire community, a statement that sounded less like governance and more like obsession. He pointed at my yard feature again, insisting it posed an undefined risk, claiming it violated standards that had never existed before that week. And when pressed to explain how or why, he shifted tactics, accusing me of undermining authority, disrespecting leadership, and encouraging dissent, as if disagreement itself were a violation. The volunteers behind him shifted uncomfortably, several of them avoiding eye contact, because even they could feel how far the situation had drifted from anything reasonable. Then came the announcement designed to break me, the one he clearly believed would end everything, when he stated that if I did not voluntarily relinquish control of my yard, the HOA would pursue forced compliance through legal escalation, including liens, penalties, and removal by third parties. And he said it with confidence, like he had used those threats successfully many times before. For a brief moment, the yard went quiet, not because people agreed with him, but because everyone understood the seriousness of what he was threatening. And that silence was exactly what he wanted, because fear works best when it spreads without resistance. I stood there listening, not reacting, not arguing, because I recognized the tactic immediately: overwhelm the target until surrender feels cheaper than standing firm. And when he finished, waiting for me to panic or lash out, I did neither. I told him calmly, clearly, and loud enough for witnesses to hear, that the Homeowner Association had no authority to place liens without due process, no authority to seize private property, and no authority to enforce anything that contradicted state statutes. And the moment I said state statutes, his expression changed, because for the first time the conflict stepped outside his comfort zone. He dismissed it quickly, claiming the HOA operated independently, claiming internal governance superseded outside interference. And that statement, spoken openly, was the moment he crossed from overreach into outright denial of reality. A neighbor challenged him directly, asking whether the board had actually voted on any of this. And instead of answering, he accused the neighbor of interference, warning that speaking against HOA enforcement could itself be documented, a threat so reckless it drew audible reactions from the crowd. Phones came out openly now, recording every word, because even those who had once been indifferent understood that what they were witnessing wasn't enforcement, it was abuse of position. The president, sensing control slipping, attempted to stage what he called an immediate compliance hearing right there in the yard. Reading from a sheet of paper he had printed that morning, declaring violations, declaring findings, declaring penalties, all without notice, quorum, or legitimacy. And the absurdity of it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so aggressive. He announced that my refusal to attend previous communications constituted an admission of guilt, ignoring the fact that none of those communications had followed any formal process. And when I told him to leave my property and direct all further communication through proper legal channels, he refused, stating that the yard was now under HOA jurisdiction, a sentence that drew a sharp reaction from multiple neighbors at once. That refusal was the most dangerous moment of the entire conflict, because it turned verbal harassment into physical trespass, and I could see it on his face that he understood the risk but believed his authority would protect him. When he moved closer to the yard feature and reached toward it, even hesitatingly, I stepped forward and told him not to touch it, and the tension in that moment was heavy, because everyone understood that one wrong move would escalate things beyond repair. He stopped not out of respect but out of uncertainty, realizing too late that there were limits he didn't fully understand. And instead of backing down gracefully, he exploded in anger, shouting that this wasn't over, that the HOA would win, that resistance would only make things worse, and stormed away, leaving behind a scene full of witnesses, recordings, and contradictions he couldn't take back. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the weight of what had just happened settled in, because this was no longer a disagreement about yard standards. It was a documented pattern of intimidation, false authority, and attempted seizure. And I understood that if this behavior wasn't confronted properly, it wouldn't stop with me. Standing there in the bright sun, notices crumpled in my hand, I felt the pressure of the moment, not fear but clarity, because the crisis wasn't that the HOA was powerful. It was that it believed it was untouchable, and beliefs like that only survive until they meet something stronger. I gathered every piece of evidence again, timestamps, recordings, statements, because now the story wasn't about my yard at all. It was about how an organization entrusted with limited oversight had convinced itself it operated above the law. And that realization made one thing unavoidable. The next step couldn't be handled within the neighborhood anymore. As the afternoon wore on and the street returned to quiet, I knew the HOA president believed he had pushed me to the edge. But in reality, he had done the opposite. He had exposed himself completely. And the crisis he thought belonged to me had already shifted, silently and irreversibly, onto him, because once state law enters the picture, there is no yelling, no rewriting, no intimidation that can stop what comes next. The turning point arrived quietly, not with shouting or threats, but with paperwork, timestamps, and authority that didn't need to raise its voice. Because while the Homeowner Association president was still convinced he could bully his way to control, the reality was that every reckless move he'd made had already triggered a response far beyond the neighborhood. Early that morning, under clear daylight, I received confirmation that my documentation had been reviewed, not skimmed, not dismissed, but formally logged. And that alone told me everything was about to change, because when state statutes are involved, speed and precision replace chaos. I gathered everything one final time, every notice the HOA had planted, every email contradicting the last, every recorded threat, every public declaration of authority that didn't exist, and laid it out in order. Because the law doesn't care about tone or intention, it cares about facts, and the facts were overwhelming. When the state representative arrived, there was no spectacle, no announcement, just a man stepping onto the sidewalk with credentials visible and purpose clear. And the shift in energy was immediate, because real authority doesn't argue, it observes. Neighbors noticed right away, gathering again not out of curiosity this time, but anticipation, because they could feel the weight of something official settling over the street. The representative examined the yard feature carefully, reviewed the HOA notices still stuck in the ground, and asked direct questions that cut through days of noise in seconds, starting with who authorized the attempt to take control of private property. When the HOA president arrived, still confident, still loud, he tried to take charge immediately, insisting the matter was internal, claiming the association had resolved it, and asserting that outside involvement was unnecessary, and the representative let him speak just long enough to document the statements, because every word mattered now. Then calmly and publicly, the representative explained that homeowners associations operate under limited authority, that they cannot seize, control, or interfere with private property without explicit statutory support, and that no internal guideline, revision, or emergency declaration overrides state law. And that explanation landed hard, because it wasn't opinion, it was statute. He cited the relevant sections by number, explained how they applied, and clarified that the HOA's actions constituted overreach, harassment, and attempted unlawful control. And for the first time since this began, the president had no response ready, because nothing in his playbook prepared him for someone who didn't need to argue. When he tried to interrupt, claiming the board supported him, the representative stopped him immediately, stating that board approval does not legalize unlawful actions, and that individual actors can be held personally accountable for exceeding their authority. And the silence that followed was heavy, because everyone understood the implication. The representative ordered the immediate removal of all HOA notices from my property, documented the condition of the yard, and issued a formal directive prohibiting any further HOA involvement with the feature pending the outcome of the investigation. And that directive wasn't a suggestion. It was enforceable, effective immediately. Neighbors watched as volunteers quietly removed the stakes they had planted days earlier, the same notices that had once been used to intimidate now being treated like evidence, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The turning point deepened when the representative requested copies of the HOA's bylaws, recent amendments, and enforcement procedures, specifically asking for documentation supporting the president's claims of expanded authority, because now the focus was just my yard, it was the association itself. The president hesitated, visibly rattled, because overnight rule changes, verbal approvals, and improvised authority don't survive scrutiny, and everyone could see it on his face, the realization that the ground beneath him had shifted completely. As the representative explained the next steps, formal review, potential sanctions, and mandatory compliance measures, the crowd began to understand the broader implications. Because if the HOA had acted unlawfully here, it likely had done so elsewhere, and quiet conversations broke out among neighbors, people comparing notes, remembering fines they never fully understood, warnings that never made sense, and sudden rule changes that always seemed to benefit control rather than community. When the representative concluded the visit, he addressed me directly, stating clearly that the yard feature was protected, that no action was required on my part, and that any further interference would result in immediate enforcement, and that clarity felt like a weight lifting, not just for me, but for everyone watching. The HOA president didn't shout this time, didn't threaten, didn't declare victory. He stood silent, eyes fixed on the ground, because for the first time his authority had been stripped away in daylight, not by anger or resistance, but by law. As the representative left and the street slowly returned to quiet, it was obvious that the conflict had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, because investigations don't end when officials leave, they begin. The turning point wasn't dramatic in the way shouting matches are, it was final in the way legal boundaries are. And as I stood in my yard again under the same bright sun where this all started, I understood that the balance of power had shifted permanently. Because the Homeowner Association had overplayed its hand, the state was now watching, and nothing the president did next would ever be viewed the same way again. The resolution didn't arrive with shouting or spectacle, it arrived with consequences, the kind that don't need to announce themselves because they carry weight all on their own, and it began the moment the state inquiry moved from observation to action. Because once the findings were formalized, the Homeowner Association could no longer pretend this was a simple neighborhood dispute. Official notices were issued to the HOA board outlining violations, not suggestions, not warnings, but documented findings that made it clear the association had exceeded its authority, attempted unlawful control of private property, and misrepresented its enforcement powers. And when those notices circulated internally, everything changed. Emergency meetings were called not to plan enforcement, but to limit damage, because suddenly the board members who had quietly supported the president or looked the other way were being asked direct questions they couldn't dodge, about unauthorized rule changes, about threats of seizure, about language that mimicked government authority, and about why no legal review had ever been conducted. Homeowners packed the meeting, not angry, not shouting, just listening as the facts were laid out in plain terms, and for many of them it was the first time they realized how much of the HOA's authority had been assumed rather than granted. The president tried to defend himself, claiming he had acted in the best interest of the community, that strong leadership required decisive action. But the argument fell flat now, because leadership doesn't survive contact with law when it's built on intimidation. The state's findings made it impossible to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, because they established a pattern, not a one-time mistake, documenting multiple instances where enforcement had gone beyond legal limits. And once that pattern was acknowledged, the board had no choice but to act. A motion was introduced to suspend all enforcement actions pending full review, and it passed unanimously. A decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier, followed immediately by a second motion addressing leadership. Because accountability doesn't stop at policy, it reaches the people who abused it. The vote to remove the president wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, efficient, and final, citing loss of community trust, legal exposure, and unilateral decision-making. And when it passed, there was no applause, no celebration, just a quiet understanding that something unhealthy had been corrected. Notices were sent to homeowners rescinding fines issued under invalid rules, clarifying the limits of HOA authority, and outlining new transparency requirements mandated by the state. and the relief that spread through the neighborhood was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations felt lighter, interactions less guarded, because fear no longer hung over every interaction with the association. State oversight continued, requiring bylaw revisions, mandatory training for board members, and clear separation between advisory guidelines and enforceable rules, changes designed to prevent exactly what had happened from ever happening again. And as those reforms took hold, it became clear that the HOA would never operate the same way it had before. As for my yard, the outcome was absolute. Formal documentation was issued reaffirming my full control and explicitly prohibiting any HOA interference with the feature, backed by penalties that ensured compliance wasn't optional. And that document did more than protect my property. It set a boundary the association could not cross again. Life settled back into routine under the same bright daylight where the conflict began, but the atmosphere was different, calmer, more open, because the illusion of unchecked authority had been shattered, and neighbors who once stayed silent now spoke freely, understanding their rights in a way they hadn't before. The former president disappeared from HOA matters entirely. No surprise visits, no raised voices, no new rules appearing overnight, just absence, and that absence spoke louder than anything he had ever said. The story didn't end with revenge or humiliation. It ended with correction, with law doing exactly what it was meant to do when invoked properly, restoring balance where intimidation once ruled. And as I stood in my yard again, hands in my pockets, biker boots on solid ground, I understood that the real victory wasn't keeping control of a piece of property. It was proving that no organization, no matter how loud or confident, gets to rewrite reality. Because authority without law is temporary, and once it's exposed in full daylight, it collapses on its own weight, leaving behind something far stronger in its place: accountability.